Let's dive into a philosophy of leadership that's, both ancient and just incredibly relevant for today. We're going to explore the principles of Umar ibn al-Khattab, a leader who saw power not as some kind of prize to be won, but as a deep, profound test of a person's character. So let's just start with this big question, one that people are still asking today in boardrooms, in governments, everywhere. What really is the true measure of a leader? Is it how much money they have, how much power they command, the number of victories they rack up, or is it something deeper? Just keep that question in the back of your mind as we look at Umar's answer. For Umar, who was the second caliph, or leader of the early Islamic community, the answer to that question was crystal clear. To him, authority wasn't a personal trophy to show off. Nope, it was a heavyweight, a huge responsibility that he believed he'd ultimately have to answer for. And right at the heart of his entire worldview is this concept of amana. Now, you can translate it as trust, but honestly, it's so much deeper than that. Think of it as a sacred divine obligation. For Omar, being a leader meant he was entrusted with the well-being of the people, and he lived with this constant awareness that one day he would have to stand and account for how he handled that trust. So how did this whole idea of amana actually work in the real world? Well, when Umar appointed governors to run new territories, their main job wasn't what you'd probably expect. It wasn't about conquering more land or expanding the empire. It was about education and justice. And look, here are Umar's own words, a public declaration for everyone to hear. He's basically saying, my governors are not warlords. They are teachers and they are administrators of justice. Their number one job was to build a society based on the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, to make sure resources were distributed fairly, and to uphold justice for everyone. I mean, that was a pretty radical idea for the time. Okay, but you know what comes with great power, right? A huge temptation, pride, arrogance. Umar was totally aware of this danger. He knew that an ego trip could destroy a leader and corrupt the very trust they were given. So he tackled it head-on, really enforcing this culture of humility that the Prophet himself had established. And this wasn't some gentle suggestion, This was a direct, serious warning to his most powerful commanders. He was constantly reminding them that their authority was a blessing, and it was totally conditional on them staying humble. He was actively coaching his leaders to fight their own egos, just as they had been taught. Now, this focus on character and humility builds into what is maybe his most counterintuitive principle, especially for a military leader. Umar believed that the real source of his army's strength wasn't their swords and shields, it was their moral virtue. So just pause and think about that for a second. We're talking about brutal ancient warfare. Where does an army's real strength come from? Is it having more soldiers, better strategy, superior weapons? Umar's answer just flips all of that right on its head. He literally believed that moral failings, sins, within his own army were a far greater threat than any enemy they could possibly face. From his perspective, divine help was granted because of their moral superiority. So the most important battle they had to fight was the internal one, the fight against their own shortcomings. All right, so we've seen how Umar expected his leaders to act, like teachers with humility, with moral virtue. But now we have to ask the big question, why? What was the bedrock, the foundation for this entire, very demanding philosophy? It all boiled down to a single, incredibly powerful principle drawn directly from Scripture. This was the ultimate allegiance he demanded, not just from his commanders, but first and foremost from himself. He would actually quote this very passage from the Quran in letters to his commanders. And it's such a stark, challenging list of all the worldly things we cherish, right? Family, wealth, our business, our homes. And there's the conclusion. The verse is this powerful reminder that if all those worldly attachments become more important to you than your commitment to God and his cause, then you, as a leader, have completely lost your way. For Umar, this was the ultimate priority check. This right here was the source of that amana. So, what's the big takeaway here? What does all this mean? Well, what we're looking at is a timeless model of what you might call servant leadership. It's this powerful idea that true leadership is actually service, that real success is measured by moral standards, not just by what you have in the bank, and that all of it flows from humility and having a higher purpose. And that really brings us to a final thought to chew on. Umar didn't crave power. In fact, he was afraid of its ability to corrupt. So in our world today, which is so often obsessed with getting power, What can we learn from a leader who was much more concerned with being worthy of it?